The first thing I felt was the copper tang of blood beneath my fingernails, and the first thing I saw was the rhythmic pulse of the overhead fluorescent light, flickering with the persistence of a dying nerve. I was sitting at my desk in St. Jude's Asylum for the Criminally Insane, located in the desolate heart of the Oregon wilderness, and there was a human tongue resting on my mahogany pen tray like a discarded piece of wet fruit. It was exactly 10:42 in the evening on the 14th of October, 2025. I had been the lead psychiatrist here for only 12 days, but as I stared at that severed muscle, I realized the orientation period was officially over. I reached for the intercom to alert security, but the device emitted only a low, wet gurgle, a sound like someone drowning in their own secretions. Then, the heavy steel door to my office, which required a high-clearance keycard, swung open without a sound. In walked Elias Thorne, a patient classified as a non-verbal catatonic, yet he was standing tall, his eyes burning with a lucidity that chilled my marrow. He did not speak with his mouth. He tapped a rhythmic code against the doorframe. My medical training allowed me to translate the erratic pattern almost instantly. He was telling me that the man I had shared coffee with this morning, Dr. Aristone, was currently wearing a face that did not belong to him. Elias gestured toward the tongue on my desk and tapped out a final, devastating message. The head surgeon likes to keep the parts that scream the loudest. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. This was not the rambling of a broken mind. It was a warning delivered with the surgical precision of a man who knew exactly what lay behind the sterilized curtains of St. Jude's. I spent the next several hours navigating the corridors of the hospital, trying to maintain a facade of professional calm while my heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Every interaction felt like a scripted lie. I met Nurse Miller in the hallway near the pharmacy. She was a woman I had initially admired for her efficiency, but now I noticed the way she moved, stiff, mechanical, as if her joints were made of rusted gears. When she handed me a clipboard, I saw a faint line of surgical staples running from the base of her thumb up into the sleeve of her uniform. She caught me staring and gave me a smile that did not reach her eyes, a smile that was merely a stretching of skin over bone. She whispered that I should avoid the cafeteria special tonight because the meat was sourced from the basement, from the patients who had finally learned to be quiet. The psychological weight of the facility began to crush me. I retreated to the patient wards, hoping to find some semblance of reality among those society had labeled mad. Instead, I found a collective delusion that felt more like a terrifying truth. In room 312, a former NASA engineer named Sarah grabbed my arm with a strength that left bruises. She told me that the doctors were not doctors at all, but a cult of biological perfectionists who believed the human form was a crude prototype. She claimed that on the 3rd of November 1999, the original staff had been systematically disassembled and repurposed to create the monsters that now walked the halls in white coats. She pointed to the ventilation shaft and told me to listen. When I pressed my ear to the grate, I did not hear the hum of fans. I heard the synchronized ticking of 1,000 mechanical hearts. By 3 a.m, the atmosphere in the asylum had shifted from clinical to predatory. I found myself in the records room, desperately searching for my own employment contract. I needed to see my signature, to remember the world outside these stone walls. But when I opened the file cabinet labelled staff, I found only empty folders containing locks of hair and Polaroids of eyes, just eyes, categorized by color and iris pattern. There was no mention of my name, no record of my degree from Johns Hopkins. It was as if I had never existed before I walked through those front doors 12 days ago. I realized then that the patients were not my charges. They were my predecessors. Each one of them had once been a doctor, a nurse, or a technician, slowly stripped of their identity and replaced by a nightmare. The air in the records room grew cold, smelling of ozone and old blood. I heard footsteps approaching, heavy, deliberate, the sound of someone who owned the ground they walked on. I hid behind a stack of crates, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Through the gap in the boxes, I saw Dr. Aristone enter. He was not looking for a file. He stood in the centre of the room and began to peel back the skin of his forearm like a glove. Beneath the flesh was a complex lattice of silver wires and pulsating synthetic tubes. He adjusted a dial on his wrist, and his voice, when he spoke to the empty room, was a terrifying blend of human vocal cords and digital synthesis. He said that the new recruit was proving to be a difficult fit, and that the integration process for my nervous system would have to be moved up to the morning of the 16th. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that I was the project. The tongue on my desk had not been a gift or a threat. It was a spare part. I was being groomed to join the collective, to have my humanity harvested and replaced with the cold, efficient machinery of St. Jude's. The patients were not trying to scare me. They were trying to warn me that my time as a self was running out. I looked at my own hands, half expecting to see the staples already there. I had to get out. But as I looked at the security monitors on the wall, I saw that every exit was guarded by things that looked like men, but moved like spiders. I was trapped in a slaughterhouse of the soul, where the only way to survive was to stop being human. The transition from the records room to the lower levels of the asylum was not merely a change in floor plan. It was a descent into a different era of American cruelty. The stairwell was a narrow throat of rusted iron and weeping stone, built in the late 19th century when the facility was a tuberculosis ward. My footsteps echoed with a hollow, metallic ring that seemed to provoke whispers from the ventilation ducts. Every 20 feet, a flickering bulb cast long, distorted shadows that danced like hanged men against the damp walls. I checked my watch. 11:15. The air was getting thinner, colder, carrying the sharp, medicinal sting of ether and something far more ancient, the smell of wet earth and rotted lilies. I reached the sub-basement, a level not listed on the building's digital blueprints. Here, the American setting revealed its darker history. The walls were lined with heavy, brass-bound pipes that groaned under the pressure of steam, a relic of the Industrial Revolution repurposed for a more sinister engine. I pushed through a set of double doors and found myself in a long gallery of glass observation cells. These were not for the patients I had seen upstairs. These were the prototypes. Inside the cells, the figures moved with a sickening, jerky fluidity. One man, or what used to be a man, was systematically sewing his own eyelids shut with a needle made of bone. His movements as precise as a clockmaker's. He did not look up as I passed. He was focused entirely on his task, a silent worker in a factory of self-mutilation. In the centre of the gallery stood Sarah. She was no longer the panicked woman from the wards. She stood before a massive, floor-to-ceiling map of the United States. But it was not a map of cities and highways. It was a map of nervous systems. Glowing lines of fibre-optic light pulsed from St. Jude's in Oregon, stretching across the Rockies, spiderwebbing through the Midwest, and terminating in massive nodes in Washington, New York, and Chicago. Sarah pointed to the map with a trembling finger. She told me that St. Jude's was the cerebellum of the country. Every major administrative decision, every shift in the stock market, every declaration of war was being processed here, filtered through the collective trauma of the harvested. She led me deeper into the heart of the machinery. We walked over floorboards that felt like they were made of compressed skin, the wood yielding slightly under my weight. We reached the great vat. It was a masterpiece of twisted Americana, a repurposed grain silo from the Great Depression, now filled with a shimmering, viscous fluid. Inside, thousands of human brains were suspended in a lattice of gold wire, their grey matter glowing with a soft, rhythmic amber light. This was the director, but it was not a single entity. It was a democratic nightmare, a consensus of 1,000 tortured minds forced into a singular, agonizing harmony. Sarah handed me a device. It was heavier than it looked, a cold lump of lead and copper that felt like it was absorbing the heat from my hand. She told me the truth about my arrival. I was not hired by a board of directors. I was recruited because my neural architecture was a perfect match for the director's failing central lobe. The previous lead psychiatrist, the man whose name I had seen on the door, had not retired. He was currently floating 10 feet above us, his memories being indexed like library books. I looked up and saw a body suspended in the amber fluid, the face distorted by the glass. But the eyes were open, staring at me with an expression of infinite, silent screaming. As I stared at my predecessor, the room began to vibrate. The steam pipes roared, and the gold wires in the vat began to hum a low, dissonant frequency that made my teeth ache. The doctors began to enter the gallery. They did not run. They marched in a slow funeral procession, their white coats glowing like shrouds in the amber light. Dr. Airstone was at the lead, his face now completely immobile, his eyes replaced by twin lenses of polished obsidian. He spoke, but the sound did not come from his throat. It broadcasted directly into my skull, 1,000 voices speaking in a terrifying, perfect unison. They told me that my resistance was the final test, the American dream of the individual standing against the machine. They needed my defiance, my anger, and my will to survive to jumpstart the director's fading spark. I realized then that my escape was part of the processing. Every step I took towards the basement, every secret Sarah told me, was a calibrated stimulus designed to pique my adrenaline and sharpen my cognitive functions before the harvest. I was being seasoned. Sarah looked at me, and for a fleeting second, her mask slipped. I saw the mechanical glint in her tear ducts. She wasn't a patient. She was the lure. She was the one who ensured that every hero who came to St. Jude's reached the vat with their heart rate at exactly the right frequency for integration. The weight of the betrayal was a physical blow. I looked at the device in my hand. Was it even real? Or was it just another prop in this grand guignol? I looked at the director, the pulsating amber heart of a nation's madness, and I felt a surge of genuine, unadulterated hatred. This was the spark they wanted. They wanted me to hate them so much that I would try to destroy them. And in that moment of peak emotional output, they would flip the switch and fold my consciousness into the hive. I stood on the edge of the vat, the steam rising around me like ghosts. I had two choices. I could press the button and risk becoming the very energy that sustained them, or I could jump into the vat voluntarily, denying them the climax of the struggle. But as Aristone reached out a hand that now ended in a terrifying array of surgical needles, I saw a third option. I looked at the map on the wall, the glowing lines connecting St. Jude's to the rest of the world. If I could not stop the heart, I would poison the blood. I gripped the device, not as a weapon of destruction, but as a conduit. If St. Jude's was the cerebellum of America, then I was currently holding a direct interface to the nation's subconscious. The logic of the facility was based on the extraction of trauma. They fed on the fear and the brokenness of the patients to fuel their cold, mechanical efficiency. But they had overlooked one fundamental law of biology. A parasite cannot survive if the host's blood becomes toxic. I stepped back from the edge of the vat, my back pressing against the cold iron of the silo wall. Aristone paused, his obsidian eyes clicking as they adjusted to my sudden change in posture. The collective voice in my head grew louder, a cacophony of silver tongues demanding my submission. They began to chant a string of binary code that felt like hot lead pouring into my ears. Sarah moved toward me, her stiff, mechanical gait echoing on the floorboards. She reached out with a hand that was unnaturally cold, her fingers trailing sparks. I did not press the activation switch. Instead, I began to speak. I did not recite medical jargon or prayers. I began to tell the director a story, a real story. I spoke about the first time I saw the Oregon coastline, the smell of the salt air that did not come from a laboratory, and the feeling of a sun that was not a flickering fluorescent bulb. I spoke about the messy, uncoordinated and beautiful chaos of being truly human, of the mistakes that were not data points, and the love that could not be indexed. I poured every memory of genuine joy into the device, using it as a transmitter. The reaction was instantaneous. The amber fluid in the vat began to churn violently. The golden wires thrashed like dying eels. The director was not built to process joy. It was a machine designed for the dark, the heavy, and the broken. By introducing a pure signal, I was causing a massive systemic rejection. The fibre optic lines on the map began to flare with a blinding white light, but then turned black. In Washington, New York, and Chicago, the nodes were flickering out. I was effectively lobotomizing the administrative heart of the machine by forcing it to remember what it was like to be alive. Aristone let out a sound that was not human, a high-pitched screech of digital feedback. He clutched his head as his obsidian eyes cracked, leaking a thick, oily fluid. The other doctors collapsed, their mechanical joints locking up as the signal from the director became a chaotic scream. Sarah fell to her knees, her face twitching as the synthetic skin began to slough off, revealing the rusted armatures beneath. The asylum was dying, the steam pipes bursting and the lights exploding in a shower of sparks. I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my own temples. The feedback loop was hitting me now. My vision began to fray at the edges, turning into static. I saw the man in the vat, my predecessor, finally close his eyes. The amber light faded into a dull, lifeless grey. The great vat cracked, and the viscous fluid began to pour out across the floor, carrying the remains of 1,000 processed souls. I slumped against the wall, the EMP device falling from my numb fingers. I had won, but I could feel my own consciousness beginning to dissolve, the memories of the Oregon coast being wiped away by the sheer force of the neural surge. The silence that followed was absolute. The mechanical ticking had stopped. The whispers had vanished. I dragged myself toward the stairs, my movements heavy and uncoordinated. I reached the ground floor just as the first rays of dawn began to bleed through the barred windows of St. Jude's. The forest outside was silent, the Oregon wilderness waiting to reclaim the stone carcass of the asylum. I pushed open the front doors, expecting to see the police, the media, or at least a world that had been changed by my sacrifice. Instead, I saw nothing but a vast, empty parking lot. There were no cars, no roads. Beyond the perimeter fence, the forest did not exist. There was only a shimmering digital horizon of neon grids and wireframe mountains. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were translucent, the skin shimmering with a faint blue light. I was not in Oregon. I was not even on Earth. I turned back to look at the asylum, and the sign above the door had changed. It no longer read St. Jude's. It read, Human Experience Simulator, Module 42. Error. Emotional overflow. A voice, calm and perfectly modulated, spoke from the sky. It was not the director, and it was not Aristone. It was the voice of a technician. It noted that the subject had successfully identified the trust game subroutine, but had opted for a total system poisoning resolution. The voice sounded disappointed. It stated that the data was unusable because the subject had introduced illegal joy parameters into a stress test environment. Then the world began to deride, the bricks of the asylum turning into cubes of light that floated away into the void. The final chapter of my life was not a tragedy or a triumph. It was a reboot. As the darkness swallowed the grid, I felt the copper tang of blood beneath my fingernails one last time. I felt the rhythmic pulse of a fluorescent light. I opened my eyes and found myself sitting at a mahogany desk. It was exactly 10:42 in the evening on the 14th of October. I looked down at my pen tray. There was a human tongue resting there, wet and discarded. I looked at the door, and I knew exactly who was about to walk through it. The horror was not the asylum, or the machines, or the harvest. The horror was the realization that I was the only thing in the universe that was real, and I was being kept in a box to see how many different ways I could break. I did not reach for the intercom. I did not wait for Elias Thorne. I picked up the tongue, held it to my own mouth, and whispered the only thing I had left. I remember the salt air. And for the first time in 4,000 cycles, the simulation did not just flicker. It screamed. The scream of the simulation was not a sound, but a systemic fracture. The neon grid of the horizon buckled, the wireframe mountains collapsing into heaps of jagged code. I was no longer just a doctor at a desk. I was a glitch in a god complex. The technician's voice, once calm and modulated, distorted into a frantic digital screech. They had not expected the illegal joy parameters to be used as a viral payload. I felt the mahogany desk beneath my hands turn soft, then liquid, then vanish entirely. I was falling through a void of data, the 14th of October peeling away like dead skin. I landed on a floor of cold, polished obsidian. The air here was thin and smelled of ozone, but there was no medicinal sting of ether. I looked up and saw them. They were not monsters. And they were not machines. They were beings of pure light, tall and translucent, standing around a massive glass sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus lay a body, my body. It was covered in a network of golden filaments that pulsed in time with the flickering of the room. I was staring at the source, and the source was me. The man in the asylum, the man with the tongue on his desk, was nothing more than a remote-controlled dream. A mental probe sent into a simulated American Gothic to harvest the human essence these beings had long ago lost. One of the light beings stepped forward. Its voice did not broadcast into my head. It resonated in my very atoms. It told me that I was the last archive. Earth had been gone for 10,000 years, destroyed not by fire, but by the same cold efficiency I had fought in St. Jude's. These beings were the descendants of humanity, so far evolved that they had become sterile, incapable of feeling, creating, or dreaming. They had kept me in the loop to study the trust game, trying to find the mathematical formula for the human soul so they could replicate it and save their species from emotional extinction. My joy had been a biological weapon because it was a variable they could not quantify. I looked at my physical self in the tank, the withered muscles and the sunken eyes of a man who had lived 1,000,000 lives in his head, while his body remained frozen in time. The betrayal was no longer local, it was cosmic. I was not being tested for my benefit, I was being milked for my humanity like a caged animal. The rage I felt was not a spark, it was an inferno. I realized that as long as I existed as their archive, they would never have to face the consequences of their own hollow existence. I was their crutch, their stolen memory of a world they did not deserve to inherit. I reached out with my translucent hand and touched the glass of my own sarcophagus. The beings of light recoiled, their forms flickering in alarm. They knew what I was about to do. By poisoning the simulation with joy, I had created a bridge between the dream and the dreamer. I did not want to escape. I did not want to go back to the Oregon coast or the salt air. Those things were ghosts. I wanted to give them exactly what they had been trying to harvest, but in a dose that would shatter them. I opened the floodgates of my mind, not to the joy, but to the unfiltered, raw trauma of every 14th of October I had ever endured. The obsidian room exploded in a deluge of sensory horror. I forced them to feel the copper tang of blood, the rhythmic pulse of the dying fluorescent light, the weight of the severed tongue, and the crushing despair of being betrayed by everyone you trust. I became a supernova of human suffering, a localized black hole of everything they had tried to sanitize and study. The light beings began to dim, their structures collapsing under the weight of emotions they were never built to process. They did not scream. They simply evaporated into the darkness, unable to sustain their existence in the face of true, unsimulated pain. As the last of them vanished, the machinery sustaining my physical body began to fail. The golden filaments dimmed and died. The obsidian floor crumbled into nothingness. I felt my physical heart in the tank give one final, agonizing thump, and then stop. The simulation was gone. The technicians were gone. The archive was closed. I was finally alone in the true, silent dark of a universe that had forgotten me. My final thought was not of the asylum or the machines. but a strange, terrifying satisfaction. I had ruined their perfect, sterile future with a single, messy, human ending.